Every night, professional wrestlers put their bodies on the line for our entertainment, but audiences don't usually get to see what happens next. These tragic, real-life stories are as dramatic as wrestling gets.
Back in the 80s, the World Wrestling Federation, now known as World Wrestling Entertainment, was a grabtastic slam-stravaganza crammed with classic characters and legendary storylines. And Andre the Giant was the atlas holding it all up. The 500-plus-pound Andre dwarfed even the most enormous of his fellow athletes. According to Sports Illustrated, one of his hands could engulf a 12-ounce beer can, and his wrists were thicker than most men's ankles. The Giant dominated wrestling for decades, but he also battled perpetually gained body mass and debilitating health problems. Meanwhile, the strain of fame destroyed him mentally. Here's the tragic real-life story of Andre the Giant.
He is said to be the largest and highest paid and best known wrestler in the entire world. Please welcome Andre the Giant.
By every measure, Andre the Giant was a whole lot of man. Besides size, he possessed unfathomable strength and a voice deeper than the ocean.
I'm not supernatural, I just myself.
Born Andre Roussimoff on a farm in the French Alps in 1946, Andre grew to be 7'4", according to the WWE, though he was likely closer to 6'11". Andre never lifted weights, yet acquaintances alleged he could lift trees and overpower 1,000-pound cows. For fun, he would occasionally wedge his friends' cars in between buildings. Andre left home at age 14 and dove into wrestling at 16. By the 70s, he was the most renowned wrestler on earth, according to the Los Angeles Times. Then, in 1973, the father of Vince McMahon branded him Andre the Giant. Sports Illustrated's Terry Todd, who traveled with Andre, observed, "Going through a revolving door, he had to bend and take tiny shuffling steps to make the door revolve. He bent himself like a contortionist to fit in taxis, and hotel bathrooms left him with no room to bathe." Andre wasn't just larger than life, he was larger than daily life. Though the WWF dubbed him the eighth wonder of the world orbited Andre like a planet. The Giant revealed in one interview, "I would give much money to be able to spend 1 day per week as a man of regular size." Acromegaly, the cause of his size, gave him an unusual visage and made him the perfect target for bullying. Hall of Famer Bret Hart witnessed grannies curse Andre out for declining to sign autographs, and Mean Gene Okerlund said the Giant would cry because of all the teasing he endured. Andre eventually found refuge in the QVC channel. Per CBS Sports, it allowed him to shop without attracting unwanted audiences. According to co-workers, Andre's liver swam in an ocean of booze. USA Today reported that ex-wrestler Gerald Briscoe claimed the Giant downed 6 bottles of wine before matches. And Modern Drunkard magazine reported he racked up a $40,000 hotel bar tab while filming The Princess Bride. In an interview with David Letterman, Andre admitted,
"Is it true that you in one sitting drank 117 beers?
Yes.
But as CBS Sports revealed, Andre was living in pain. Years of wrestling and arduous travel ravaged his body, and his disorder caused his bones and joints to thicken, inflicting further stress. Pharmaceutical solutions existed, but he refused to take them. As filming for The Princess Bride began, Andre transformed into the lovable Fezzik. William Goldman, who authored both the screenplay and the book that inspired it, told CNN it was the only casting choice he specifically envisioned while writing the script.
It's not my fault being the biggest and the strongest. I don't even exercise.
Andre was so good in the role, it seemed inconceivable that he wasn't already a Hollywood heavyweight. No Small Parts reported Andre had previously played monsters, but The Princess Bride emphasized his humanity and allowed his personality to shine. Co-star Cary Elwes, who played Wesley, called him a real gentle giant who would give you the shirt off his back. During his incredible career, Andre battled many beasts. He knocked out the great Gorilla Monsoon, nearly flattened Harley Race, and defeated Hulk Hogan. But the Giant's biggest opponent was time. At age 23, Andre learned he could die by age 40, according to friend Jackie McCauley. She told CBS Sports that Japanese doctors offered to operate on him before time ran out, but the Giant declined. 20 years later, Andre's knees were buckling, and he was becoming entombed in his body. As the Los Angeles Times detailed, by the early 90s, he was immobile. Once a titan who carried the wrestling world, Andre now needed others to do the heavy lifting. In January 1993, Andre returned to France to attend his father's funeral, and on January 27th, the giant's gentle heart stopped beating. He was 46. The Los Angeles Times reported Andre wanted to be cremated and for his ashes to be spread over his North Carolina ranch. But no crematorium in France could handle a man of his magnitude. So best friends Jackie McCauley and Frenchie Bernard flew his body to the States, where it was reduced to 17 pounds of ashes, according to Bleacher Report.
When you got one true friend like him, that's all you need in this world, a true friend.
Andre named 3 people in his will: Jackie, Frenchie, and his daughter Robin. He signed it not as Andre, but as A. Roussimoff, a man who caught everyone's eye, but who few people really saw.
Kurt Angle may be the ultimate wrestler, with Olympic gold and plenty of time spent in WWE, but that doesn't mean it's been an easy path for the wrestler. He's battled more than his fair share of tragedy in his time. Here's the tragic real-life story of Kurt Angle. Everything Kurt Angle has accomplished in his life, he's had to do without his father, who passed away decades ago thanks to a fatal freak accident. David Angle was a crane operator who attended all of Kurt's wrestling matches and football games. In 1985, when Kurt was 16, his father fell out of a 15-foot-high crane and landed on his head. Even with his skull cracked, David Angle walked himself to the hospital, but he slipped into a coma and died 2 days later. Kurt responded to this catastrophic loss by doing what he did best, excelling at athletics. He had an amazing football performance the same week his father passed. That said, his father's death might have been why young Kurt eventually became the man he did. As he said in his autobiography, "I grew up and overcame my fears the day my father died. I vowed right then and there to become a champion, to do whatever it took." David Schultz, who won Olympic gold in 1984, helped Angle train for the 96 Games, but never got to see his protege triumph. Schultz and Angle were members of Team Foxcatcher, a wrestling squad financed by wealthy philanthropist John DuPont. Sadly, DuPont had serious mental issues that, according to court testimony, got worse as his team prepped for the Olympics. He threatened multiple wrestlers, including pulling a gun on one while kicking him off the team. On January 26, 1997, DuPont shot David Schultz 3 times. For that crime, DuPont was sentenced to prison and died behind bars in 2010. A devastated Angle wound up being the only member of Team Foxcatcher in the Olympics, and he dedicated himself to honoring his trainer's memory as best he could.
In case you didn't know, I won a gold medal with a broken freaking neck.
Throughout his pro wrestling career, Kurt Angle has constantly bragged about winning his gold medal with a broken freaking neck. He said it enough that it's become a well-worn catchphrase, so it's easy to forget just how serious the incident really was, and how it helped to start him down a long path of injury and addiction.
3 months before the Olympics, and this is right before the Olympic trials, I broke my neck at the US Open.
Angle landed hard on his head during Olympic trials, herniating 2 discs, cracking 2 vertebrae, and pulling 4 neck muscles. And yet, despite suffering injuries that absolutely should have knocked him out of contention for the Games, he soldiered on. When he went in for his MRI the next day, his doctor ordered him to rest and heal for at least 6 months. That would have taken him out of the Olympics, so Angle found a doctor who was, in his words, either smart enough or stupid enough to allow him to wrestle. Angle rode this new doctor's plan all the way to Olympic gold, but unfortunately, he also developed a long-time need for more. Kurt Angle is far from the only wrestler to battle drug addiction, but his fight has been particularly difficult. In addition to the Olympics, Angle has suffered many injuries as a pro wrestler, which led him to develop an addiction to painkillers of all sorts. According to interviews, he even had a system where he'd go from doctor to doctor, as many as 10 at a time, to get various prescriptions. By 2006, he told the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review he was still clean, but unfortunately that didn't last. During a 2014 CBS interview, Angle admitted to a 7-year battle with a potentially lethal cocktail of morphine, Xanax, and alcohol that he had only kicked about a year before. Along the way, those drugs helped him rack up 4 DUI arrests. One in August 2013 when Angle was arrested in Texas for reckless driving. It was one too many arrests for the Olympian. Shortly after, he announced on Twitter that he was going to rehab, saying, "In light of recent events, I will immediately be entering a rehabilitation center. I realize that this is a pivotal time in my life, and I ask for your understanding as well as your prayers and continued support." By 2003, Kurt Angle had already experienced more than enough tragedy to go with his triumphs, but more heartbreaking news was on the way. Kurt's sister Leanne lost her life to a heroin addiction. Her devastated brother didn't talk about it publicly for a long time, until the 2014 YouTube video journal he put together to chronicle his comeback after surgery. As he explained, he dealt with her death in roughly the same way as his father's death and his coach's, through athletics. In this case, he wrestled a scheduled 1-hour match with Brock Lesnar just a day after Leanne's passing. And while it was an incredible match, in retrospect, Angle realizes it was a pretty awful grieving mechanism.
I went out there and had one of the best matches of my life. I hid the pain. And you have to realize dealing with the pain is a part of life.
Though Kurt Angle's life has been largely clean and drama-free since around 2014, he recently had to deal with one of the worst things anyone could possibly face: the realization that a family member is a killer. On September 20th, 2015, Angle's brother David called 911 to say his wife Donna was unconscious. According to him, the two had a domestic argument that ended with her death, and shortly after, David Angle was arrested and charged with homicide. In June of 2016, David pled guilty to a lesser charge of involuntary manslaughter and was sentenced to a maximum of 10 years in prison. While Kurt wasn't involved in this incident, any death in a family can be difficult to deal with, and one as senseless and violent as this can be truly haunting.
Professional wrestling is a dangerous job, and it's not uncommon for wrestlers to pass away before their time. For some of them, the end comes before they even leave the ring. Here are professional wrestlers who died in the ring, sometimes with an audience and sometimes without. Mitsuharu Misawa is one of the biggest names of all time in Japanese wrestling. He rose to fame in the 1980s as Tiger Mask, a character who, naturally enough, wore a tiger-themed mask. He was so popular that when he unmasked in 1990, his fame only increased. In 2009, he was a 46-year-old veteran who had been named Professional Wrestler of the Year 3 times and was still competing. The tragic match that cut Misawa's stellar career short occurred on June 13, 2009. One of his opponents gave him a back suplex, a fairly common move. However, what happened next shows that nothing in wrestling is truly routine, and even the most basic moves can turn into tragedies. Misawa didn't move after the impact. The match was immediately stopped. All the wrestlers surrounded the ring, and the crowd softly chanted Misawa's name as doctors and nurses tried to administer CPR. He was declared dead at a hospital, though he was likely already lifeless before he was moved away from the ring. The official cause was heart failure. Malcolm King Kong Kirk was a well-known British monster heel and a frequent tag team partner of the even more massive Giant Haystacks. This former rugby player didn't use a gimmick, as his 350-pound frame was more than enough to intimidate his opponents. On August 23, 1987, Kirk faced off against Shirley Big Daddy Crabtree, who said Kirk had the strength of 3 people. The match proceeded exactly as planned right up until the end, when Big Daddy gave Kirk his finishing move, a big splash that saw him jumping on his prone opponent. Kirk never kicked out from that finisher. The 50-year-old powerhouse was left lying in the ring, but it wasn't the finishing move that killed him. An inquest of the incident discovered that Kirk died of a pre-existing heart condition. Big Daddy was cleared of all responsibility, and even Kirk's widow said she held no ill will against her deceased husband's final opponent.
As long as I live, I'll never forget seeing him laid down there on the canvas, instead of on his feet raging and flying about.
Wayne Van Dyke, aka Richard Delicious, was an independent wrestler working Florida's small promotions. He was just 29 years old when he suffered a series of heart attacks that started during a tag team match at an event arranged by the Ronin Pro Wrestling promotion. He complained to his tag team partner that he wasn't feeling well and suffered the first heart attack right after tagging himself out. After that, things went from bad to worse. The attempts to give him CPR on the scene left Van Dyke with at least 1 broken rib and a punctured lung. He then suffered a second heart attack on his way to the hospital. When he finally reached the facility, he had a third one. At that point, hospital staff had to put him in a medically induced coma. Unfortunately, the damage was too much for his system, and Van Dyke's family soon confirmed the wrestler's passing on Facebook. Japanese wrestler Plum Mariko died in the ring after her opponent powerbombed her in 1997. It wasn't until after the match that the other wrestlers realized that she still hadn't moved and was now snoring, which was a sign that her brain was bleeding. She was rushed to the hospital, but surgery couldn't save her. The 29-year-old died of brain damage. Mariko had accumulated a collection of nasty injuries over the years, including multiple concussions and an undiagnosed brain abscess. Doctors believe she died because of the combined effects of these injuries rather than a single one from the powerbomb. They also said that if she had been examined earlier, she likely would have lived because no doctor would have let her wrestle in her condition. Mariko's passing was the first in-ring wrestling death in Japan. What makes her fate even more tragic is that the signs of brain damage were there. Owen Hart was a member of the legendary Hart wrestling family. At the time of his death in 1999, his gimmick was a masked superhero character known as the Blue Blazer. For the May 1999 Over the Edge show, the WWF decided to give him an entrance befitting a superhero in which he would fly in. An elaborate system of wires was set up to lower him to the ring from the rafters above, but the system malfunctioned while he was 78 feet above the ring, sending him plunging down as he hit the top rope and then bounced into the ring. Though the incident never made it to television, the 16,000 people at Kansas City's Kemper Arena witnessed the futile attempts by the medical staff to revive Hart, who died of internal bleeding. At first, some of the audience members thought the whole thing was a stunt and that the falling figure had been a doll. However, this impression wouldn't last long. The ring announcer soon informed the audience what had just happened was completely unscripted. Before the event was over, WWF commentator Jim Ross announced to the world that Hart was dead.
Wrestling is a dangerous business, and it can prove to be fatal inside the squared circle too, as these pro wrestlers' stories tragically illustrate. Sometimes, one wrong move is all it takes to turn a normal sparring match into a heartbreaking tragedy. Brian Ong and the Great Khali found this out the hard way in 2001 when Khali accidentally killed Ong in a dramatic training mishap that no one could have predicted. The incident wasn't a case where the massive Khali was clumsily manhandling another wrestler. Instead, it was Ong who botched the move known as a flapjack. The move is executed by lifting the opponent up and pushing them in the air, so they land on their face and chest when they hit the mat. Instead of going along with this, Ong held on to Khali's shirt and came down hard, severely hurting his head and spine. As such, Khali never faced any repercussions for the dramatic accident. All pro wrestling, on the other hand, found itself in seriously hot legal waters. The fact that APW allowed Ong to keep working despite his many injuries ended up costing the promotion around $1.5 million in a settlement. On March 21, 2015, a Mexican wrestling legend named Pero Aguayo Jr. died. The popular luchador met his fate in a match where he faced another Lucha Libre superstar, Rey Mysterio Jr. The tag team brawl pitted Aguayo with his partner Manic against Mysterio and Extreme Tiger. Unfortunately, the match ended in a tragedy when a flying kick from Mysterio connected with Aguayo. The impact threw Aguayo into the ropes, where he was left unconscious and kneeling. The match went on for 2 minutes before the other wrestlers and the referee realized the man dangling in the ropes was actually seriously hurt and stopped the match. However, nothing could be done to save Aguayo. His vertebrae had snapped when his head hit the ropes. His ultimate cause of death was a heart attack, brought on by a cervical stroke from his broken neck. Unsurprisingly, the incident deeply shocked the apologetic Mysterio, who had unwittingly caused his friend and colleague's untimely demise. However, Aguayo's family understood the situation and asked Mysterio to act as one of Aguayo's pallbearers.
The fans were like, Ray, come on, man, we know what happened. You can't. Right. You can't let this affect you.
Dan Spider Quirk was a kid that seemingly everyone liked. He was a talented, passionate, up-and-coming independent wrestler who worked with various promotions and was part of the close-knit Connecticut Championship wrestling community. Apart from wrestling, he did a ton of work behind the scenes and even ran the CCW website. He also had a number of close friends in the industry. Then, on May 28, 2005, tragedy struck. Quirk had a match at a Universal Championship Wrestling event in Taunton, Massachusetts, when he missed a moonsault and crashed headfirst onto the floor outside the ring. Quirk was only 22 when he died. Later that year, the CCW promotion gave Quirk the indie wrestler's equivalent of a Viking funeral when they dedicated their Wrestle Jam 2 event to his memory. Before the show, they held a ceremony where the entire CCW roster came out to the ring and remembered their fallen friend, sharing their favorite stories with the audience. They even had some serious star power among them. Wrestling superstar Matt Hardy was a guest at the event and respectfully stood by Quirk's friends and comrades for the entire ceremony. After some speeches and a highlight reel, the lights went back up. The promoter told the audience that the show would start soon, and it would be all right to laugh and have fun. After all, Spider would have wanted the show to go on. Larry Moondog Spot Booker had one of the most glorious ring names in all of pro wrestling, with the possible exception of his final tag team partner, Moondog Puppy Love. Booker was a pioneer of the ruthless and hardcore wrestling, working as Larry Latham in Memphis Wrestling until he was picked up by the then WWF as a replacement for a departing member of the Moondogs tag team, Moondog King. Initially partnered with Moondog Rex and working a rabid dog gimmick, Booker had a solid tag career in both the WWF and Memphis and even found some solo success. On November 29, 2003, the most recent version of the Moondogs faced 3 other tag teams in a concession stand brawl match in a Memphis event that celebrated wrestling legend Jerry the King Lawler. The match ended in tragedy when Booker had a sudden heart attack. Describing the events that unfolded, Moondog's manager April Pennington said, "Things were going fine in the ring. He asked me for the belt to use as a weapon. The next thing I knew, he was down." Initially, everyone thought that Booker was simply working the match and selling an injury. However, as soon as Moondog Puppy Love noticed that something wasn't right, the match was hastily finished and the audience was informed of the situation. Sadly, CPR wasn't able to revive Booker, and the 51-year-old wrestler was pronounced dead in the hospital. Wrestler Gary Albright died in the ring during a wrestling show in Pennsylvania. Reportedly, Albright was on the receiving end of a bulldog, a move that involves a wrestler grabbing his opponent's head and jumping forward, thus slamming their head into the mat. While that's certainly true, it should be mentioned that the full story is significantly more complicated. Albright was a former amateur wrestling state champion who transitioned to pro wrestling in 1988. He largely plied his trade in Japan, where his wrestling accolades allowed him to specialize in unscripted, realistic shoot wrestling. Unfortunately, it took a toll on his health. On January 7, 2000, Albright was making a rare US appearance in a match against Lucifer Grimm and was left lying in the ring after a bulldog maneuver. However, it was not the move that killed Albright. The wrestler's heart was in pretty bad shape. It was enlarged and he had multiple blocked coronary arteries. He also suffered from diabetes. As a result, Albright suffered a fatal heart attack as he took the move, and officials could do little more than pronounce him dead after removing him from the ring. He was only 38. Jesus Javier Hernandez Silva was better known as Oro, and he was only 21 years old when he died. The wrestler met his fate in 1993 when he took part in a 6-man tag team match in Mexico City. It's said that he had told the other wrestlers that he was planning a kobashi bump, a complicated way of taking a move and hitting the mat head first. Exactly how Oro died is subject to some controversy. Reportedly, he oversold a clothesline move with an enthusiastic spin that landed him on his head. One of his opponents immediately tried to pick him up, but Oro collapsed on the mat and died on a stretcher before they could get him in an ambulance. David Shoemaker's book, The Squared Circle: Life, Death, and Professional Wrestling, also tells this version of the story. However, Kyle Dunning of eWrestling News states that the footage of the event doesn't seem to support this. Instead, he says that while Oro did land hard on his head, he managed to stay on his feet for some time, though he wasn't able to land any offensive moves anymore. He eventually collapsed outside the ring. Still, regardless of the precise course of events, everyone can probably agree that Oro's death was extremely tragic and that he left us far too young. Lucha Libre star Cesar Silver King Barón suffered a fatal heart attack in the ring during a performance in London, England on May 11, 2019. Silver King was a famed Mexican luchador who also made an impact on the silver screen. In 2006, he notably starred in the Jack Black comedy Nacho Libre as the antagonist Ramses.
You are the best.
Silver King was wrestling Juventud Guerrera in an event billed the greatest show of Lucha Libre when he unexpectedly fell down in the ring. He managed to get back on his feet after half a minute, only to collapse again while Guerrera, who didn't know anything was amiss, attempted to continue the match. According to Silver King's son, the performer was healthy and drug-free going into the match, but he didn't get back up again. Those who were present called out the event's apparent lack of trained medical personnel and the fact that it took a long time for anyone to notice the wrestler's in-ring predicament. After Guerrera pinned Silver King to end the match, it took a reported 2.5 minutes for anyone to react to what happened. Speaking about the situation that unfolded, a witness said the following: "It was odd that no medics rushed up. It didn't seem like anyone was on hand." Wrestlers then came out and started giving him CPR. Silver King's son later expressed his belief that quicker action might have saved his father's life.
Whether you know Dave Bautista as a fearsome WWE superstar or as a galactic guardian named Drax, you're probably a fan. Dave Bautista is a really likable, personable, agreeable sort of person, but it's kind of surprising if you know very much about what Dave Bautista has been through. Bautista was born in 1969, and according to his book, Bautista Unleashed, the Washington, D.C. area he grew up in was one of the nation's poorest at the time. As he was growing up, crack cocaine was about to hit the streets, killings in the neighborhood were common, and according to him, life expectancy for children was, quote, worse than in many third world countries. Bautista casually mentions that 3 people died on his doorstep before he turned 9. In an interview with the Tampa Bay Times, he elaborates on one particular death where his mother found a man dying of a gunshot wound outside their house. She called for help, but the officials took too long and the man didn't make it. Meanwhile, Bautista, his sister, and several other children were playing outside nearby. They were so accustomed to violent sights that they didn't even shed a tear, and after Bautista's mother saw it, the family promptly moved to San Francisco. In his book, Bautista briefly dwells on his lack of formal education. Though he enjoyed wrestling in high school, his actual grades were far from amazing. By his senior year, which he didn't finish, they were so bad that he wasn't allowed to wrestle. Bautista says not graduating from high school is something he regrets, especially because he knows he absolutely could have done it if he had tried. Whenever he bothered to apply himself, he got good grades and his teachers were perfectly willing to let him make up assignments. However, young Bautista just didn't care about education, and it remains a sore spot. In an interview with Sport Bible in 2018, Bautista admitted that if he could live his life again, he would focus on getting an education. Bautista might look like he was built at a shipyard, but he has a family just like everyone else, if maybe a slightly more turbulent one. Dave writes in Bautista Unleashed that his dad, a Filipino hairdresser, wasn't really prepared to be a father. Bautista also had an older brother who died in a car accident. Dave's mother, Donna Ray, managed to bring up her children while also struggling with poverty and family issues of her own. After separating from Dave's father, she started having relationships with women, which was a potential social problem for a woman coming from a conservative Greek-American family. In an interview with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, Bautista says, "I never thought of her as my mom the lesbian. She was Mom, an incredibly strong woman who always did her best to keep me out of trouble and keep me alive." To drive home his pro-LGBTQ stance, he once even threatened boxer Manny Pacquiao for making anti-gay comments. Troubled youths tend to dabble in crime, and young Dave Bautista was no exception. On the podcast Anna Faris is Unqualified, Bautista says his childhood gang used to specialize in petty theft. They'd go down to the houses of kids they knew and steal small stuff like clothes and knickknacks they couldn't afford.
We're always like stealing stuff and stealing this, stealing that, and the police would pick us up and my mom would have to come get us and beat the hell out of me.
Bautista has since called his youthful, thieving ways kid stuff, but puberty turned him into a completely different beast. According to the Tampa Bay Times, Bautista grew large and intimidating during his later teenage years and ended up taking on a protector role in his group. He eventually ended up with an imposing body that made a career as a nightclub bouncer a pretty logical choice. Unfortunately, Bautista turned out to be a bouncer of the splatter variety, and he roughed up unwanted clientele so much he was once even charged with assault. If you've ever wondered what it takes to get a body like Dave Bautista's, you might not like the answer. In a 2019 interview with the Tampa Bay Times, Bautista says he spent his 20s in a state he calls reverse anorexia. Despite being a fresh father of 2 daughters, he had no real plans or ambitions, so he got stuck in a loop. He worked all night as a bouncer, then spent hours at the gym, and by the time he got home, he'd sleep all day and start the cycle anew. Despite weighing over 300 pounds and doing virtually nothing but working and lifting, he felt he was never big enough. Bautista spent 10 years on this schedule, which didn't do any favors for his family's financial stability. As he was pushing 30, he realized he had wasted a decade of his life and was in a situation where he had to borrow money just so he could buy Christmas presents for his children.
And I realized that I had accomplished nothing and I had no future and I had nothing to fall back on.
This bleak situation ultimately came with a silver lining as the impoverished Bautista decided to try his hand at wrestling. Dave Bautista entered the physically grueling world of wrestling at a relatively late age. This may be why his first star-making tenure with the company was marred by injuries that sidelined him for months at a time. According to Bautista Unleashed, his first serious injury was a triceps tear that sidelined him for 7 months in 2003. Bleacher Report listed other notorious mishaps. In 2006, he was forced to vacate his WWE World Championship because of yet another torn triceps. In 2008, a similar tear occurred in his hamstring, sidelining him for what was supposed to be 6 to 8 months. He came back in 4 and had just enough time to capture the WWE Championship before a biceps injury forced him to drop the title the very next day. A lower back injury later stopped him from completing a scheduled circuit of shows. In 2006, Bautista allegedly got into a real backstage fight with fellow wrestler Booker T. WrestleView reports the fight took place when the men shot an ad for the upcoming SummerSlam. Bad blood had supposedly been brewing for quite some time because of Bautista's bad attitude. His relatively quick rise to the top of the food chain and lack of humility had angered many of his colleagues. Colleagues were also reported to be quite happy with the way Booker T stood up to Bautista, hugging and high-fiving Booker afterward. WrestleView also reported that Bautista confirmed things had been escalating for a while. It must be noted, though, that the initial reports of the fight's legitimacy appear to have come from the WWE itself, and Bautista and Booker T were promoting their title match at SummerSlam. According to Forbes, there have been allegations that Bautista was aided by every dishonest athlete's best friend, steroids. In 2007, the aftermath of the Chris Benoit case led the WWE to take a long, hard look at the company's wellness policy, and an ESPN report eventually linked Bautista and a number of other wrestlers to a large doping ring. Bautista strongly denied the allegations and insisted that he was both tested regularly and operating, quote, in full compliance with the WWE wellness program. While he ultimately avoided suspension, the cloud of steroid suspicion has hovered over his head ever since. Wrestling Inc. and Bleacher Report have both reported on industry whispers about past steroid use, and some of his injuries seem oddly consistent with the ones steroid users commonly suffer. According to Sportskeeda, Bautista has quit WWE twice, in 2010 and 2014. His first departure was reportedly because of a lack of movie opportunities, as Bautista discovered WWE studios wouldn't offer him roles. He asked if he could go outside the WWE and audition for other films, but was allegedly told to get dressed for a match. Bautista handed in his notice and left the company a year later, and on his last night, few people bothered to thank him or say goodbye. He made a comeback in 2013, but creative differences soon drove him out again. He reportedly wanted a slow build-up as a bad guy, but the WWE decided to strongly push him as a hero, and the fans didn't love it. According to Bautista, it didn't help that when he pitched a cross-promotion with Guardians of the Galaxy, WWE big shots Triple H and Stephanie McMahon basically laughed in his face. Bautista returned to the WWE one last time in 2019 when he wrapped up his wrestling career in a WrestleMania match against Triple H. Bautista lost. The life of a top WWE superstar isn't an easy one to mesh with private life, and Dave Bautista has been less than successful at it. In an interview with Sport Bible, Bautista admitted that the year-round grind of being on the road with the WWE didn't do any favors for his marriage. According to Australian Broadcasting Corporation, he ruined 2 of his marriages while he was on the road, and it wasn't just his constant absence that was the problem. The superstar admits he was a prolific cheater, and that obviously also hurt the people he loved. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation reports that while Dave Bautista doesn't drink or do drugs, he was no different from his wrestling peers who struggled with addictions. His drug of choice just happened to be a little different. Although he didn't realize it at the time, he was addicted to carnal pleasures while touring with the WWE. When the naturally shy and timid man became popular and suddenly had scores of girls interested in him, he says he was completely unequipped to handle it and dove in head first. While he didn't think it was a problem at the time, he was eventually told that his constant womanizing was a problem. He says he has since matured and changed because he doesn't want to hurt his business or be a bad role model for his children. Bautista's role as Drax the Destroyer in Guardians of the Galaxy propelled him to mainstream fame, but according to Wired, the dream gig could get surprisingly nightmarish. Bautista was terrified when he auditioned. His first day on set wasn't any better because, apart from his own nerves, he was unfortunate enough to start filming 2 weeks later than everyone else. When he arrived, the anxious giant had to scramble to catch up. When the existential terror went away, physical discomfort took over. The role required buckets of makeup and body paint, which took 4 hours to apply and another hour and a half to remove. Because the full upper body treatment didn't really allow the actor to sit down, he had to go through the entire process leaning on a saddle-like perch. However, getting it all put on wasn't as bad as having to don the Drax costume for many consecutive days. He says that by the 3rd or 4th day, his skin started to get sensitive, and by the 6th consecutive Drax day, he just wanted to peel his skin off. A large, muscular wrestler can often carry the stigma of people assuming he's a big, stupid lug, and Dave Bautista faces an extra hurdle. He's dyslexic. In an interview on Chris Jericho's Talk is Jericho podcast, Bautista says his dyslexia has made things like table reads for Avengers Infinity War and other films pretty difficult for him. Still, the wrestler has kept a sense of humor about his condition and has been known to reply to badly spelled Twitter insults with friendly advice about how to deal with dyslexia.
You Earthers have hang-ups.
As it happens, Bautista isn't the only Guardian of the Galaxy who deals with dyslexia. According to the New York Times, his castmate Zoe Saldana is also dyslexic, and Dyslexic Advantage has praised both stars for publicly speaking out about their struggles.
Pro wrestlers put their bodies through hell for your entertainment, and some die young in the process. And while many die by accident, more than one was murdered. So who did it? Keep watching to find out. Chris Benoit grew up in Edmonton, Alberta, where he first started dreaming of becoming a wrestler. By the time he was 18, he was training in the Dungeon, the gym of Canadian wrestling patriarch Stu Hart. In 2000, Benoit joined the WWF. The Calgary Herald wrote of him, "Benoit was never a larger-than-life cartoon personality like the famous Hulk Hogan. Rather, he was the strong, silent type, a straight shooter who won the fans' respect by virtue of his work in the ring, sans gimmicks." And then, things went horribly wrong. In 2007, Benoit died by suicide after murdering his wife Nancy, who was also a wrestler, and his 7-year-old son, Daniel. Fans, families, and colleagues had a hard time reconciling the family man, friend, and hero they once knew with the man who could commit such a treacherous crime. According to ABC News, Chris Nowinski of the Sports Legacy Institute got in touch with Michael Benoit, Chris Benoit's father. He told him, "I thought brain injuries may have played a role in what happened, and it was worth doing the studies." Dino Bravo was born Adolfo Bresciano in Italy in 1948, but grew up in Canada and was often billed as the Canadian strongman by the WWF. Deadspin wrote, "Bravo was archetypal of a slightly outmoded sort of bad guy wrestler in a number of ways. The bleached hair, the procession of weaselly managers, the my buddy's strong dad physique." He got his start wrestling in Canada, but soon went on to wrestle with the WWF, winning the Tag Team Championship in 1978. But according to Slam Sports, his career faltered in the WWF due to steroids. Still, over the course of his career, he grappled with some of the biggest names in the business, including the Hart Foundation, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, and Kerry Von Erich. In 1992, after a great career despite many losses, he decided to retire. After retiring, Bravo joined the Mafia through his wife's family connections. Bravo became involved in cigarette smuggling, and after a deal went bad, he was shot 17 times in his home while watching TV. Bravo was only 44 years old. The crime has gone unsolved to this day, most except, given his line of work and the horrific nature of the killing, that it was Mafia-related. The Ultimate Warrior was a huge WWF star in the 1980s. He is best remembered for his neon face paint, tiny bikini briefs, and the uncomfortably tight strings tied around his bulging arms. According to WWE, while most superstars slowly walked to the squared circle, Warrior sprinted full speed down the entrance ramp and ran circles around the ring before shaking the ropes like a man possessed. His matches were quick too. At the 1988 SummerSlam, he defeated the Honky Tonk Man in under 30 seconds. His greatest claim to fame is beating Hulk Hogan at the 1990 WrestleMania 6, and then Randy Savage at WrestleMania 7. He even originated those Slim Jim commercials Randy Savage became famous for.
You boys a bit bored? Snap into it!
Then he kind of disappeared, leading to all sorts of rumors. After occasionally popping up over the decades, he attended his Hall of Fame induction ceremony on April 5, 2014, and announced he had signed a deal to become an official WWE ambassador. It wasn't to be, though. Tragically, just 3 days later, the Ultimate Warrior died of a heart attack at age 54. Fritz Von Erich, aka Jack Atkinson, was a famous wrestler in the 60s and 70s who trained under Stu Hart. He was best known for his signature move, the Iron Claw. Later, he became known as the patriarch of the Von Erichs, a brood of boys who would almost all become professional wrestlers. But tragedy haunted the family. In 1959, oldest son Jack Jr. drowned at the age of 6. In 1984, David, who was known in the wrestling ring as the Yellow Rose of Texas, died in a hotel room while touring Japan. He was just 25. The official cause of death was ruptured intestines, but close friends and family members have speculated that he may have died from an accidental overdose of painkillers or possibly a heart attack. Then, tragically, 3 more of the brothers, each in turn, took his own life. Mike was 23, Chris was 21, and Carrie was 33. Of the 6 siblings, only Kevin Von Erich, known as the Golden Warrior, survives at the time of this video. In the 1940s, Luther Lindsay played college football and wrestled, but due to segregation, he could only play against other Black Americans. When he decided to play professional football, he found work with the CFL. While in Canada, he met Stu Hart and trained with him, after which he moved back to the US to begin grappling for the National Wrestling Alliance. According to the WWE, not only did Lindsay train under Stu Hart, he also holds the rare distinction of having defeated Stu in the dungeon itself, which earned Lindsay such a degree of respect that Hart carried a picture of him in his wallet for 50 years. In the late 50s, Lindsay became the first man to wrestle in an interracial match. He took on Ron Wright, known back then as the #1 Hillbilly, in Kingsport, Tennessee. According to an interview with White for Kayfabe Memories, they had the National Guard up there, thinking they were going to have riots. Lindsay went on to be the first Black wrestler to compete for the NWA World Heavyweight title. His competitor, Lou Thesz, said of Lindsay that due to segregation, it was an amazing accomplishment for Luther to even learn his craft. His place in history is not because he was Black, it is in spite of the fact he was Black. Lindsay went on to win multiple championships, but in 1972, at age 47, he had a heart attack in the ring while pinning his final opponent. Lindsay has been inducted into both the National Wrestling Hall of Fame and the WWE Hall of Fame. Don Eagle was a famous First Nation wrestler from the Kahnawake Mohawk territory near Montreal, Canada. Inspired by his father, wrestler Joseph War Eagle, Don began grappling at age 20. Like his father, he also wore a full headdress. According to Last Word on Sports, Eagle, quote, became the first recognized Native American World Heavyweight Champion when he won the AWA World Heavyweight Championship in the American Wrestling Association. Chief Don Eagle was one of the first generations of wrestlers to be a part of the television era. In 1950, he had his most infamous match against Gorgeous George in Chicago, and it was televised. At the end of the match, the referee tapped the ground 3 times to declare Gorgeous George's victory, but Eagle still had one shoulder off the mat. The crowd was furious, and according to Slam Wrestling, Gorgeous George needed police assistance to escape the ring. Don Eagle put his hands on the referee and was suspended, but he was later able to regain his title. Eagle went on to have a great career, even being a part of what would eventually become the WWE. In 1963, at age 38, he went into semi-retirement due to numerous back injuries. 3 years later, he was dead. It was declared that he had killed himself, but many, including his longtime friend, wrestler Two Rivers, believe he was murdered. Gorgeous Gino Hernandez was a wrestler famous for being affable and, well, gorgeous. Gino was inspired to go pro by watching his stepfather, Luis Hernandez, work in the ring. Luis died when Gino was only 12 years old, motivating the boy to train at a young age under Jose Lothario. Gino started his professional career at only 17 years old. According to Pro Wrestling Stories, Gino wore his stepfather's boots during his first few matches and credited Luis for how easily wrestling came to him, saying, "My dad did it for me. I was wearing his boots. He did everything for me." Gino formed a tag team with his mentor Jose Lothario, only to dump him for Gary Hart. Gino became more of a heel, which is a wrestling term for villain in the ring, and he and Lothario began to feud. Gino went on to win the NWA Junior Weight Championship and team up with Jake the Snake Roberts. Gino began to get a reputation for doing drugs and hanging out with shady people. In 1986, he was found dead in his condo in Dallas, Texas. He'd been dead for 4 or 5 days, making it hard to determine the cause of death. A loaded gun was found, but drugs were not. At first, it was declared a homicide, but after an autopsy found an enormous amount of cocaine in Gino's system, they called it an overdose. Many remain skeptical and think he was murdered. Gorgeous Gino was only 28 years old. Brian Pillman was famous for being a talented wrestler who really knew how to work the audience. Pillman had a difficult childhood. His father died of a heart condition when Brian was only 3 months old, and throat polyps required him to spend a lot of time in hospitals. Pillman went on to be a star football player in high school and then a free agent for the Cincinnati Bengals. But it was when he played for the Calgary Stampeders that he found his true love, wrestling. He trained with Stu Hart in the dungeon and became, for all intents and purposes, part of the Hart family. Later, he was allowed to join the Hart Foundation. Pillman was one of the first wrestlers in the US to adopt the lucha style of flying in the ring, earning him the name Flyin' Brian. Brian succeeded in all of the promotions he was a part of, ECW, WCW, and eventually the WWF, winning multiple championships. But his personality on the microphone made people believe he was a loose cannon. At Super Brawl 6, after losing to Kevin Sullivan, he took the mic and revealed that Sullivan was actually the person who booked the shows, after which Pillman was fired. According to Pro Wrestling Post, Pillman knew what he was doing. He was headed to the WWF and Vince McMahon. Tragically, in 1997, at age 35, Brian was found dead in his hotel room, his bright career cut short. He died from an undetected heart condition, much like his father. Bruiser Brody was born Frank Goodish. Like so many wrestlers before him, he started as a football player. While playing for West Texas State, he was discovered by Fritz von Erich and began his wrestling career. According to the WWE, his 6'8", 300-pound frame made him a star from the very beginning. But the big man's career began to build steam in 1976 when he arrived in WWE and was rechristened Bruiser Brody. Brody grappled all over the globe, fighting everywhere from Indianapolis to Japan to Puerto Rico. And it was in Puerto Rico that his career ended when he was brutally murdered. In 1988, right before a match, Bruiser Brody was stabbed to death in a locker room shower by Jose Gonzalez. Though their views were obscured during the stabbing, wrestlers Tony Atlas and Dutch Mantell said they witnessed the events immediately before and after the murder. According to Oxygen, Gonzalez was ultimately charged in connection to Brody's death, but he claimed he acted in self-defense. Atlas and Mantell were summoned to testify, but didn't receive word until after Gonzalez had already been acquitted. Gonzalez was able to continue his career and to this day gets paid to visit kids' birthday parties. Rest in peace, Bruiser. Eddie Guerrero grew up in El Paso, Texas, watching his father Gory Guerrero, a once famous lucha libre wrestler, grapple professionally. Eddie and his three brothers, Chavo, Hector, and Mondo, followed their father's footsteps into the squared circle. Eddie rose through the ranks, working matches in Mexico, Japan, the ECW, and then the WCW. According to the WWE, once he joined the WWF, quote, Eddie wasn't just Eddie anymore. He was Latino Heat. Guerrero won 5 different WWF/WWE titles. In 2001, Guerrero went to rehab for an addiction to pain medication, which reportedly stemmed from a car accident. Then he was arrested for drunk driving. Eddie was let go from the WWF, but was able to return in 2002. In 2004, he had an incredible match, winning the WWE Championship. But in 2005, while staying in a hotel in Minneapolis, he was found dead just hours before an upcoming appearance. Tragically, he died of heart failure at age 38.
Macho Man Randy Savage seemed larger than life, but being a pro wrestler is no picnic, and the man behind the persona had his share of difficulties. This is the tragic real-life story of Randy Savage. Athletic, bombastic, and loud as he was, Macho Man Randy Savage seemed like a man who was born, or perhaps constructed, to be a professional wrestler. However, his original aspirations were quite different. As Bleacher Report tells us, young Randy Poffo nursed dreams of becoming a professional baseball player. In a 2012 interview with IGN, Savage made it clear how much he'd loved his time in the minor leagues, saying, "I was a catcher. It was really cool. I loved every second of it, every bus ride, all my teammates, every game." Savage made the rounds in the minor leagues, trying to make it with the Cincinnati Reds, St. Louis Cardinals, and Chicago White Sox. According to Sports Illustrated, he even overcame a potentially career-ending shoulder injury by painstakingly teaching himself to throw left-handed. Unfortunately, his grueling work was in vain. None of the organizations he played for were willing to pick him up for the major leagues, and when the Sox cut him in the spring of 1975, it became apparent that he wasn't going to make it. To say that he took it extremely hard would be an understatement. In 2015, Savage's mother Judy said, "When Randy got released, he broke all his bats and got rid of all his equipment. It was horrible." As CBS Sports tells us, Randy Savage's Macho Man mode wasn't always limited to the ring and interviews. According to fellow wrestler Steve the Brooklyn Brawler Lombardi, Savage was very intense and retained his distinctive Macho Man persona both on and off the camera. His interviews, when he spoke, it was not just on TV. He spoke like that in real life. "Oh yeah, let me tell you something, brother." Per Sports Illustrated, pro wrestling legend Stone Cold Steve Austin has expressed a similar sentiment. His intensity, his promo style, he was the Macho Man 24/7, 365, and he was that before he got to the WWF. Sadly, Savage's constant intensity also manifested in less savory ways. In 1978, he was involved in a massive brawl at a Waffle House and was so out of control that the police needed to use their batons, mace, and a police dog to take him down. Savage later admitted that he was, quote, a little hyper. According to the Morning Call, another even worse incident landed him in court in 1988. Allegedly, a fan approached him when he was idling at a red light and asked for an autograph. Savage's alleged response was to get out of the car, punch the fan in the face, and body slam him before reportedly saying, "How's that for an autograph, boy?" Jake the Snake Roberts is one of the more tragic figures in the pro wrestling community, and when he crossed paths with Randy Savage in 1991, dark clouds loomed on the horizon. Roberts' gimmick involved live snakes, and as Pro Wrestling Stories tells us, it soon became evident that Savage wasn't happy when he found out that his upcoming match with Roberts would end with him getting bitten by a snake. In fact, Roberts says that he eventually had to let that snake bite him in the locker room to convince Savage that the snake wasn't dangerous. When the match took place, though, things went awry. Though the snake bit Savage as planned, it soon became apparent that the animal wouldn't let go. As Roberts put it, "I'm trying to pull it off. I'm trying, and the snake's just gnawing on his arm. It's going on for like a minute now, you know?" In a 2004 interview with IGN, Savage discussed the aftermath of the incident, which ended up hospitalizing him. "About 5 days later, I had a fever and went to the hospital with 104-degree fever. It's unbelievable to walk into the hospital and tell the doctor I had a snake bite." Macho Man ultimately survived his ordeal, but curiously, Jake's snake died soon after the incident. Savage gave us the obvious explanation. He was devenomized, but maybe I wasn't. For a long time, the most important figure in Randy Savage's professional and personal life was the same person, Elizabeth Ann Hewlett, whom you probably know better by her wrestling moniker Miss Elizabeth. As Sports Illustrated tells us, Macho Man and Miss Elizabeth were a wrestler and his valet, but also husband and wife. This actually applied to both their in-ring roles and real-life situation. They got married for real in a small ceremony in 1984, and their characters followed suit in a rather more opulent in-ring ceremony at 1991's SummerSlam at Madison Square Garden. Unfortunately, their doubly committed union didn't turn into happily ever after. Savage was an extremely jealous man and tried to protect, or as it often appeared, hide Elizabeth from the prying eyes of fellow wrestlers. As Hulk Hogan described it, "If you even looked at Elizabeth the wrong way, then holy shit, Randy would freak out. If you ever wanted to get him lit up, you'd just have to look at Liz." Despite, or perhaps because of this, Miss Elizabeth filed for divorce in 1992. To add insult to injury, Savage's later WCW tenure used their divorce as part of a storyline.
Randy, how's Miss Elizabeth doing?
Well, bottom line is we got a divorce.
It's almost impossible to talk about Randy Savage without bringing up his most famous tag team partner, Hulk Hogan. As TalkSport tells us, Macho Man and the Hulkster started out as bitter in-ring enemies, but in 1987, the powers that be decided to pair the two superstars. The ensuing tag team was very fittingly known as the Mega Powers, and judging by the fact that Hogan was the man who inducted Savage into the WWE Hall of Fame, it's easy to think that these two pillars of pro wrestling remained buddies for life. Alas, as is so often the case, the reality was far unhappier. In 1992, Savage's marriage with Elizabeth Hewlett fell apart. Hogan ended up receiving a lot of heat about this thanks to an incident that happened soon afterward. Hewlett was a family friend, and the Hogans took her with them for a trip to Miami. According to Pro Wrestling Stories, Hewlett was dating an acquaintance of Hogan's at the time. And when a furious Macho Man eventually turned up, the situation got nasty enough that some say Savage actually gave Hogan the black eye he had in WrestleMania 9. After this incident, Savage had plenty of unpleasant things to say about Hogan, and even stated that the pair were never friends. Hogan, on the other hand, has been more mellow, and he's even stated that the pair ultimately reconnected and reconciled. In 2008, Bleacher Report wrote that Macho Man Randy Savage was blacklisted from the WWE. The idea of one of the biggest names in pro wrestling being banned from working with the biggest wrestling promotion is a strange one and begs the question, what exactly did Savage do to get on Vince McMahon's bad side? In an industry as rife with rumor as professional wrestling, it may be impossible to ever find out the truth behind the story. However, it's clear that the relationship between Savage and the WWE became rather strained around the year 1994, when the WWE was known as the WWF. At the time, Savage's contract was nearing its end, and he was seemingly happily pulling double duty as a color commentator and occasional mid-card wrestler. However, Savage split for the rival promotion WCW the second he could. Some say that this broke a verbal agreement he had with McMahon. Others have speculated that the WWE owner was bitter because Savage's departure meant the company also lost the Slim Jim ad dollar, since the meat snack was so associated with the Macho Man. Some suggest that another factor may be that Savage signed with a bitter enemy just as his WWE magazine cover issue came out. As Sports Kita reports, there's even an odd rumor that Savage had an affair with McMahon's daughter, Stephanie. Regardless of what really provoked the WWE's ire, the promotion basically purged all mentions of Savage for years. Randy Savage was a great many things, but perhaps above all, he was a man who loved his father. According to Bleacher Reports, his relationship with Angelo Poffo was by far the most important in his life, and he molded his life after his father's teachings. Considering that Angelo was a tough-as-nails wrestler who once held the world record in sit-ups with no fewer than 6,000 reps, this was no easy feat, but Macho Man inherited his father's perseverance. Savage's frugality, also a lesson learned from his father, didn't extend to his parents, whom he lavished with so many expensive gifts and luxurious vacations that they eventually had to tell him to stop. Unfortunately, even beloved patriarchs get old, and the strong and determined Angelo slowly succumbed to dementia. Though he cared for his father until his death in 2010, the situation was extremely hard for Savage. As Mother Judy put it, Randy prayed for Angelo to die because he suffered so much, but when he did die, Randy went home and punched holes in the walls. Macho Man Randy Savage lived an intensely physical life, and he suffered his share of nasty injuries over the years. According to Sports Illustrated, his first major injury came before he even started wrestling. In 1973, he was still trying to make it as a baseball player when an incident described as a home plate collision wrecked his right shoulder. As Bleacher Report tells us, Savage's actual wrestling career wasn't much kinder to his body. In fact, towards the end of his life, he often talked about the daily pains he lived with.
Kid, I'm not gonna lie to you, I'm in a tremendous amount of pain.
Curiously, one of the worst injuries of the Macho Man's life had nothing to do with his dangerous in-ring endeavors. It came from acting, of all things. In 2002, Savage played a fearsome wrestler called Bonesaw McGraw in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. In this role, he got to battle a superhero.
And we got this guy called Spider-Man. Beat him up, knock him out.
But the price for this prestige was high. The fight required several takes of a particularly nasty bump that involved McGraw landing on his head. Being a professional wrestler, Savage refused to use a stuntman. As a result, his neck was more or less irreparably wrecked. Savage's brother Lanny explained, he needed a lot of physical therapy, but he was never the same. Instead of turning his neck to see you, he turned his torso. Even wrestling legends can't live forever. As the Los Angeles Times tells us, Randy Savage died at the wheel on May 20th, 2011, after losing control of his vehicle in Pinellas County, Florida, and crashing into a tree. However, Bleacher Report notes that there was more to the story. The medical examiner found that the 58-year-old Savage was suffering from atherosclerosis and also had an enlarged heart, which gave out as he was behind the wheel. Before the incident, he complained to his wife Lynn that he was about to lose consciousness. Despite this, Savage refused to relinquish the wheel until he fainted and the car crashed. Thankfully, the impact was fairly light and Lynn got away with only minor injuries. At the time of his death, Macho Man was a much more reserved figure than the colorful character the world knew and loved. He had gradually turned into something of a hermit who lived behind a fence, shunned the company of most people, and essentially refused to keep in touch with the wrestling community. He also seemed eerily certain that he'd meet an untimely fate, and was quick to tell his loved ones that he didn't want a large funeral. Then again, he also seemed to enjoy the small tasks and errands of life and appeared to be at a peace of sorts. As his brother Lanny put it, he was getting closure for everything. In his heyday, Sylvester Junkyard Dog Ritter was so popular with the fans that he could give Hulk Hogan a run for his money. But thanks to a multitude of unfortunate twists and turns, he never quite reached his full potential. Here's the tragic real-life story of Junkyard Dog. Junkyard Dog was a talented performer with a natural charisma that could arguably match most performers of his era. So it can seem strange that his time with the WWF, now known as WWE, wasn't more stellar. As Bleacher Report notes, the wrestler was easily the biggest star in Mid-South Wrestling, and even when he moved to the WWF, the audience would often go nuts whenever he appeared. In wrestling terms, he was over with the fans. Wrestling Observer reported that he could even outshine an all-time great like Ric Flair. Wrestler Buddy Landel said, "I've never seen anyone who was over like Junkyard Dog in his prime. I was never around Hogan in his prime, but I was around Ric Flair in his peak, and he was never over like JYD." But the WWF never quite capitalized on Junkyard Dog's popularity with the fans. Though his tenure with the company involved some high-profile opportunities, including tag team bouts with Hogan himself, he was generally treated as a mid-level talent. His profile on WWE.com confirms he never won a single WWF championship. While JYD was eventually inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, his actual time with the company seems to have largely ignored his potential as a top star.
I got the people in the wrestling ring, I got the people outside the wrestling ring cheering me on, I got the people in the crowd when I'm singing cheering me on, so we're all going to do it together.
Junkyard Dog was a charismatic guy, but that didn't make him exempt from the casual, sometimes cruel racism that pervaded pro wrestling. In the WWF, commentator Jesse the Body Ventura referred to his popular post-victory dance as a lot of shuckin' and jivin', and claimed that his speech sounded like he had, quote, a mouthful of grits. Even his super popular stint with Mid-South Wrestling was somewhat marred by racism. As Deadspin points out, Junkyard Dog's opponents often used racist invective against him. And what's more, he didn't choose the chains he wore as his gimmick. Wrestling promoter Bill Watts came up with the idea. Fortunately, Junkyard Dog was often able to be the hero, since he was almost always the babyface or good guy of the feud, and his opponents were often rather openly racist against him. He was often presented as a heroic figure fighting against racial injustice, and the crowd was cheering him. During his days in the Mid-South, Junkyard Dog was a beloved hero who used Queen's Another One Bites the Dust as his entrance music. He was almost too beloved. One of his stranger feuds at the time involved his enemies, the fabulous Freebirds, blinding Junkyard Dog with hair cream. This coincided with the real-life birth of his daughter, and the prospect of the heroic wrestler not being able to see the baby got the crowds very, very mad. The Freebirds soon needed police protection. Wrestling Observer noted that the story almost ended in a disaster when the blind Junkyard Dog took the ring to address his adoring audiences, some of whom were apparently convinced that he had actually lost his sight and had to leave the business for good. When the Freebirds inevitably entered the ring to gang up on the helpless Junkyard Dog, one fan actually entered the fray and pointed a gun at one of them. Fortunately, no one was shot. Security overpowered the gun-toting fan and took him away. Substance abuse was a notorious problem for many wrestling stars of Junkyard Dog's era, and he was no exception. The wrestling movement reports his struggle with addiction started in the 1980s, when he operated with the aid of cocaine among other drugs, which you could occasionally hear during some of his more energetic promos. The Wrestling Observer notes that Junkyard Dog soon developed a cocaine habit that caused him to neglect training. His promoter at the time, Bill Watts, tried to protect his top performer, whose wrestling ability was rapidly declining, and whose significant weight gain soon destroyed his once impressive physique. It was clear that Junkyard Dog had problems that went way beyond his in-ring prowess. Perhaps the best description of Junkyard Dog's relationship to drugs comes from the Iron Sheik, a fellow wrestling legend who has also faced down problems with addiction, and who, according to Maxim, got his first taste of crack courtesy of Junkyard Dog. The Sheik said of JYD, "He my friend, but he no perfect." Junkyard Dog's lifestyle started to take a toll on his body. According to the wrestling movement, his cocaine and alcohol use were weighing him down, both in the ring and out. As Wrestling Observer notes, his increasing sloppiness severely hurt his popularity at Mid-South Wrestling, and though the WWF eventually brought him to bigger and more visible arenas, JYD's personal struggles continued. He also developed a propensity for unhealthy eating, which earned him the unsavory nickname Junk Food Dog. Junkyard Dog's professionalism started to creak under his many excesses. He started skipping scheduled appearances, and though the WWF gave him some leeway, the company ultimately decided to let him go. In 1988, Junkyard Dog returned to the NWA, which soon became WWF rival promotion WCW. But both his star power and performances were disappointing, and he left in 1991 for the independent circuit. JYD was more or less aware of his situation, though he was never able to get fully clean. In his later years, he was quite open about his addictions and the toll they had taken on him. His friend Ted DiBiase, known to WWF fans as the $1 Million Man, revealed that shortly before Junkyard Dog died, he gave DiBiase permission to use him as an example to steer kids toward better life choices. Junkyard Dog's 2 marriages went so badly that one of them involved a kidnapping and a gunshot. The details of his first divorce are somewhat unclear, but his arduous travel schedule seems to have played a large part. After the split, his ex-wife spent some time at a mental institution, after which she kidnapped their daughter from Junkyard Dog's parents' house. On his quest to find his daughter, the wrestler soon burst through the door of his former brother-in-law's house, and the ensuing confrontation ended with his ex-wife's brother, a police officer, taking an accidental gunshot. The end of Junkyard Dog's second marriage didn't involve quite as much drama, but it was devastating to his finances. He reportedly lost pretty much all his earthly possessions, including his car and home. Every pro wrestler hangs up their boots eventually, but Junkyard Dog's retirement years were more tragic than most. According to the wrestling movement, he didn't have much to show for his wildly popular wrestling career in his later years. He spent much of his post-wrestling time doing odd jobs with no permanent home. Junkyard Dog clung to wrestling as long as he could, pleading in vain for chances from his former promoters and appearing in occasional independent shows to the point that his declining in-ring ability allowed. This may have been a money thing, but according to sportscasting, his sheer love for the job seems to have been a significant factor too. Promoter Guy Walters explained, he retired in 1988, and 10 years later he was still in the ring. He had a hard time giving it up. He enjoyed it all, the big crowds, the small. It didn't make any difference as long as he was around to sign autographs and take Polaroids with the kids. Walters also revealed that Junkyard Dog made sure to tell those kids to make better life choices than he had. Walters said of JYD, every kid he'd meet, he'd say, "Are you still in school? Stay there, baby. Do it."
If I had to pick my faves, I'd go with The Undertaker or Junkyard Dog. How about you?
The final tragedy in Junkyard Dog's life came in the summer of 1998, was twofold and happened over a single weekend. As Wrestling Observer reported, he made an attempt to attend the high school graduation of his daughter, only to find out that he'd arrived too late and she had already gone to celebrate with her friends. He never saw his daughter again. The following morning, Junkyard Dog started his journey back, but he never made it. As he was driving on Interstate 20, Sylvester Junkyard Dog Ritter died in a single-car accident that sent his vehicle rolling 3 times. He was 45 years old. 5 days later, the pro wrestling star was buried in Wadesboro, North Carolina. Apart from his former comrade Buddy Landell, the professional wrestlers he'd worked with all his life were largely absent from the ceremony, though some sent flowers. However, the Junkyard Dog's impact was still clear, as the crowd that attended the funeral was up to 2,000 strong. Michael Jordan, a North Carolina native and fan, reportedly reached out with his condolences. Junkyard Dog's daughter, LaToya Ritter, was instrumental in many dramatic turns of her father's life. According to Wrestling Observer, her father's inability to see her was a major part of the infamous blindness storyline during Junkyard Dog's Mid-South days. Ritter's graduation weekend in 1998 also ended with her father's fatal car accident. She was also the one who represented her dad when he was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2004. Unfortunately, like her father, Ritter also passed away at an early age. On October 19, 2011, she was talking on the phone when she had a sudden heart attack at just 31 years old. A family friend said, "Doctors said she was gone before she hit the floor. As tragic as her loss is, there's consolation in the knowledge that she didn't suffer." The Iron Sheik was a big name in professional wrestling, but he paid a heavy price for the fame. This is the tragic real-life story of the Iron Sheik. In an industry of scripted events, plot lines, and characters, it would be easy enough to imagine that the Iron Sheik is actually just some dude from Ohio. This couldn't be further from the truth. According to Lou Friedman's book Pro Wrestling, a comprehensive reference guide, the future Sheik really spent his early days in Iran's capital, Tehran. The honorific of his wrestling character wasn't very accurate though, because his family was actually quite poor. According to Bidun, Hussein Khosrow Ali Vaziri was born in 1943 to a pistachio farming family. He spent his early days without amenities such as running water, and as he grew up, he had to go through mandatory military service. This was presumably no picnic, but as a silver lining, it did give him ample time to hone his wrestling craft and even become the Army's wrestling champion. So how did a young man from Iran end up dominating stateside pro wrestling rings? By being disillusioned by the mysterious death of his hero. As Bidun tells us, the reason the Iron Sheik became interested in wrestling is a man named Gholam Reza Takhti, an Olympic gold medalist in freestyle wrestling. The extremely famous Takhti hailed from the same neighborhood as the future Sheik, so he was a natural role model for Vaziri, and the young man soon found himself on a similar career path. Only 3 years after taking up wrestling, Vaziri was a national high school champion. While Vaziri's love for wrestling would endure for decades to come, the man who inspired him met an untimely end. Takhti died in 1968, and although the official explanation was that he'd killed himself, there were whispers that the athlete had been taken care of because he'd been getting too political. The news made young Vaziri realize that his trajectory and Takhti's were too close for comfort. He said, "I knew I had to leave. If Iran was not good for Takhti, it was not good for me." And so the Sheik went to America. As Lou Friedman's Pro Wrestling and Comprehensive Reference Guide tells us, the 1980s was not a good time to be a famous foreign villain. The Iron Sheik was able to draw heat and become successful, but it reflected pretty badly on his personal life. The Sheik was such a successful baddie that, as Yahoo Sports notes, he earned up to $500,000 a year in his heyday, somewhere between $1.2 million and $1.6 million in today's money, adjusted for inflation and depending on the year. Unfortunately, this money came at a cost that was far higher than getting booed on a nightly basis. Multiple wrestling fans attempted to beat Sheik up or even stab him. In an interview with Vice, he recalled one instance when he had to leave a venue hiding in an ambulance, terrified of the mobs outside. Things got so bad that he started to fear for the safety of his family and stopped taking them on the road. Though the Iron Sheik's evil foreigner gimmick and various villainous antics may have been the most enduring image of his wrestling career, it should be remembered that he was also a very, very good wrestler. Bleacher Report notes that when he still lived in Iran, he was a common sight in international tournaments. Things didn't exactly cool down when he moved stateside, and Bidun tells us that his accolades of this era include the gold medal in the 1971 Amateur Athletic Union Championship, as well as 2 silvers in the 2 years before. He was also a good enough wrestling coach to serve a stint as an assistant coach for the U.S. Olympic team. The Sheik was very proud of his medals, and much like Olympic gold-winning pro wrestler Kurt Angle after him, he liked to keep his bling on full display during his TV appearances. Unfortunately, this proved to be too tempting for some, and the Sheik reportedly lost his precious prizes when they were stolen from his hotel room in Newark, New Jersey. It would be easy to think that after a long, hard day of acting as a magnet for America's hatred, loathing, and dropkicks, the Iron Sheik would like nothing better than to drop the character and kick back as himself. Unfortunately, Bleacher Report tells us that he's been known to find this quite difficult. When he was starting out in the 1970s, the Sheik came from a legitimate amateur wrestling background, and he found it hard to accept the scripted nature of pro wrestling. Turns out the Sheik was a good learner, and as he settled into his character, he became so adept at being phony that he often stayed in the role in his downtime. This was, of course, a bit of a problem, since the Iron Sheik was a cartoonish wrestling heel. Sometimes things got so bad that he started randomly dictating what individual people could buy and eat while they were shopping in the supermarket. Considering what a massive name the Sheik was in his prime, the modern equivalent for this would probably be if the MCU villain Thanos suddenly ambushed you at Walmart to berate you about the amount of microwave meals in your cart.
I am inevitable.
The Iron Sheik might have caused plenty of in-ring havoc in his prime, but as the Sportster tells us, one of his most notorious victims was the very concept of kayfabe itself. Kayfabe, if you're not familiar with wrestling jargon, is the pro wrestling industry's system of keeping up appearances. Basically, the heroic faces and villainous heels play their designated roles and steer clear of each other in public, no matter how well they privately get along. In 1987, the Sheik inadvertently put a massive dent in this idea when he ended up in hot water with a fellow wrestler Hacksaw Jim Duggan. As the Associated Press reported at the time, the pair were driving to an event together and were arrested when it turned out they had marijuana and, in the case of the Sheik, cocaine. This was a minor problem. However, as Bleacher Report notes, the huge problem was that Duggan and the Sheik were a face and a heel, happily traveling in the same car. This caused massive waves in the wrestling circles, and as a result, the World Wrestling Federation promptly fired both men. Though the Iron Sheik has been a stern and dedicated athlete for most of his days, Yahoo Sports tells us that his life and career alike have suffered from his long-term substance abuse issues. He was already struggling with a crack cocaine addiction during his heyday, but that was far from the only intoxicant he developed a taste for. What's worse, he was known to mix alcohol with whatever drugs he could get his hands on. According to Bleacher Report, the Sheik's devotion to both his sport and his Shiite Muslim beliefs meant that he steered clear of the more carnal aspects of life for longer than most. Likewise, he didn't bother with drink and drugs until the pro wrestling community's liberal approach to narcotic substances swept him off his feet. Though the Sheik has attempted to clean up his act at times, he's had more than his share of relapses, and his addiction has bled into his personal life as well. He's had at least one bender that ended in a minor heart attack, and at one point, his wife temporarily left him because of his drug use. Going purely by his character, the Iron Sheik might seem like the most self-assured person in the world. However, the man behind the impressive mustache has gone through some dark days, and he's reportedly struggled with depression in various points of his life. Per Badoon, the first time the Sheik fell in deep depression was when he was still living in Iran, and his idol, famed wrestler Gholam Reza Takhti, died in what were thought to be somewhat suspicious circumstances. Remember, this is what prompted the future pro wrestling legend to start a new life in the United States. As Bleacher Report tells us, another even more hurtful loss came in 2003 with the murder of the Sheik's daughter. Though his immediate reaction was to swear off drugs in order to better aid his grieving family, he eventually found the grief too much to bear and started using again. It was during this hazy period that he started his late-life side gig as shock jock Howard Stern's foul-mouthed guest. And Bleacher Report describes his tantrums of the time as, quote, fueled by drugs and emotional destitution. Fortunately, the Sheik was able to kick drugs after his wife finally left him. They eventually reconciled, and by 2013, he seemed to occupy a much healthier mental space. A professional wrestler can't get to the top of the industry without experiencing his share of pain, and the Iron Sheik's tolerance for unpleasant physical sensation is quite significant. Unfortunately, even the Sheik has his limits, and as Yahoo Sports tells us, his thoroughly worn down and broken body reached them long ago. The Sheik's wife, Carol, said in 2013, "He's in such great pain almost all the time. A part of this nigh constant torment comes from the natural wear and tear from a life as a pro wrestler, but Mrs. Vaziri names a pair of botched knee surgeries around 2003 as the main culprit. She said, "He hurts everywhere, but the knees are really painful. He told me, 'Carol, I hurt from the top of my head to the bottom of my toes.'" This kind of constant torture makes one suspect that if the Sheik could rewind time, he'd go for a very different career path. However, the wrestling legend appears to adamantly disagree. He said, "I love wrestling and I would do it all again, but it is a very, very hard business. There is nothing about it that is easy."
Jake the Snake Roberts, born Aurelian Smith Jr., has entertained millions of wrestling fans with his creepy antics, giant snake, and top-notch mullet. He's an 80s WWF icon just as much as Hulk Hogan or Randy Savage, but the Snake's life story has been tragic from the start. Early in his life, Jake had to deal with his grandmother dying of cancer, his beloved stepfather being electrocuted to death, and constant abuse from his stepmother. Roberts also endured the tragic death of a sibling, the reason why haunts Jake to this day. As Jake recalled in the documentary Jake the Snake Roberts, Pick Your Poison, he had a sister whose name he didn't disclose. After a childhood full of abuse, she ran off with a 55-year-old man when she was just 18. According to Roberts, a year after his sister left, she had a child with this older man. Then the man's ex-wife showed up, kidnapped Jake's sister, and killed her. Unfortunately, the courts could never prove a crime took place since they never found the body, meaning the ex-wife only got 10 years in prison on the kidnapping charge. Once released, she and her ex collected the money from Jake's sister's life insurance and ran off together. Jake funneled all the tragedy into his untrustworthy character. As he explained, "I never wanted you to trust me." As Jake recounted in an interview with Slam Sports, he rarely saw his father, pro wrestler Grizzly Smith, more than a couple times a year because the old man was always on the road. Plus, Smith never bothered telling his son that wrestling is staged. As far as Jake was concerned, his father was always on the brink of getting killed in the ring because his opponent was out for blood. After graduating high school, Roberts attended one of Smith's matches and decided to challenge another wrestler. Jake, untrained and drunk, got battered and stretched worse than he'd ever been. After the ordeal, his father laid into him, calling him gutless and telling him you'll never amount to anything. Such callousness motivated Jake to pursue wrestling full-time to show his dad how wrong he was. He also hoped to, one day, finally hear his dad say he was proud of him. Sadly, it never happened. Knowing what Jake's gone through, it's little surprise that Roberts eventually turned to drugs and alcohol to cope with his difficult life. While most fans know he's been an addict since at least the 90s, the truth is he started much earlier, long before anyone knew who he was. Roberts says he started drinking at age 11, around 1966. He began wrestling in 1975, and the drinking only escalated from there. What's more, once on the road full-time, he added drugs to the mix, even doing speed on occasion. But alcohol was his biggest and most damaging vice by far. As he put it, it no longer became a choice to drink. It was a necessity. I was in a bad mood and underproductive and couldn't get up off the couch unless I had something to drink. Despite all that, he had an image to uphold since he portrayed a good guy for much of his WWF tenure. He posed for a Just Say No to Drugs poster, even if he couldn't say no himself. As he told Salon, "I felt nasty doing that poster, but you do what you're told sometimes." Sadly, few, if any, higher-ups told him to get help until it was almost too late. How's this for irony? Jake the Snake Roberts, a guy famous for carrying humongous pythons to the ring, often on his shoulders, admitted to Sports Illustrated in 2015 that he, quote, "can't stand snakes." And yet there he was, hanging around with a 12-foot python called Damien, night in and night out. Damien, to put it mildly, kicked his butt. As he told one website, carrying that 100-pound snake around was brutal on my body. Between weeks' worth of clothes, wrestling gear, and the giant snake, it's quite possible Jake's body was hurt more by traveling than getting thrown around the ring. It's little wonder he preferred working with Lucifer, the devenomized king cobra he wielded when he was such a bad guy. Cobras may be scary, but they only weigh 15 pounds. Jake dealt with this fear every night because he saw his snake as a wall to keep people from learning too much about the man behind the slithery creature. As he told SI, the snake was something to hide behind. Everyone was scared of the snake, and that's exactly what I wanted. I didn't want anyone to get close to me. I wanted everyone to be afraid of me. According to the Pick Your Poison documentary, after Jake left WWF in 1992, he and WCW agreed to a mega deal worth up to $3 million per year. He never saw that money. Shortly after agreeing to the contract, WCW hired a former wrestler named Bill Watts to run the place. Watts voided Jake's contract, forcing him to sign for $200,000 per year. While that's certainly enough to feed most families, it's a slap in the face when you were just promised 15 times that amount.
Either you take a pay cut or go and look for another job.
During a panel at Tidewater Comic-Con, Jake revealed why Watts did it. Apparently, Watts had a deal with WCW where he made a percentage of the money he saved the company, so he was cutting down contracts left and right, including Jake's. For that, and presumably for other reasons, Roberts called Watts a, quote, "sorry piece of shit without a good bone in his body." It's little wonder Jake left WCW in 1993. Still, it might have been a blessing in disguise. If he was drinking that much on a mediocre salary, he probably wouldn't have survived with more money to buy booze.
Until the late 90s, fans had no clue how bad Jake Roberts' personal demons truly were. That all changed thanks to events like Heroes of Wrestling, a pay-per-view that exposed the hopelessness of Jake the Snake's situation. Roberts was set to wrestle Jim Neidhart, but in a pre-match interview, he showed he was in no condition to wrestle.
You want to play 21? I got 22. You want to play blackjack? I got 2 of those too.
He was so drunk he could barely stand up. He was no better in the ring, forcing fans to rub his bare chest, pretending his snake was his genitals, and stumbling around the ring while barely acknowledging anything Neidhart did. Things got so awkward and bad, the promoter had to send 2 other wrestlers out to make it a tag team match, simply so Roberts didn't embarrass himself any further. It didn't really work, as Jake attempted to end the show by stuffing Damien down another man's trousers head first. The crew faded the show to black immediately, proving they had more sense than whoever allowed Roberts to even attempt wrestling in the state he was in. You might think embarrassing himself in front of a TV audience would be the wake-up call Roberts needed to turn his life around, but you'd be wrong. As it turns out, he needed it to happen again before change could start. In 2008, Roberts was booked against indie wrestler JT Lightning at a Firestorm pro wrestling event. But as TMZ reported, he was done long before hitting the ring. He was apparently passed out in the locker room with mere moments to go before he was set to wrestle. More than 20 bottles of airplane vodka were littered all around him. After being woken up and angrily demanding an 8-ball, Roberts stumbled into the arena and began mumbling at both the fans and Lightning. The actual match lasted maybe a minute. After Snake stumbled to the mat, an exasperated Lightning forcefully held him down for an unscripted 3 count. He said Lightning had ripped off all the fans who paid to see him. Roberts responded by flashing the crowd, punching a wall, breaking his hand, and running out into the streets crying. The Snake had truly hit bottom, and even then, it would take 4 more years before he found the help that would save his life. When your life is mostly drugs and alcohol seasoned with a little wrestling, you're probably running afoul of the law every now and again. In Jake's case, he and the law had a long-running feud that wasn't nearly as fun as his WWF rivalries. In May 1989, Roberts was arrested at a WWF show and charged with aggravated battery. According to the Orlando Sentinel, he punched out a man in a Florida bar the previous December. He was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to 10 years probation. Luckily for him, an appellate court concluded Roberts' lawyer hadn't done an adequate job and nullified the verdict. This was just the start of Roberts' legal woes. In 2004, he got nabbed on animal cruelty charges. Allegedly, the python playing Damien at the time didn't eat for months, as Roberts had kept him in a tank and left him there. By the time animal cruelty inspectors discovered Damien, it was too late, and the snake died shortly after. Sadly, this is what can happen when someone who hates snakes is in charge of one. The following year, Roberts was arrested on charges of possessing drug paraphernalia, specifically a crack pipe. Cops also got him on an outstanding 1999 warrant for unpaid child support. Thankfully, Roberts has kept his nose clean since then, at least in the eyes of the law. Nobody knows what else he's gotten away with except Jake himself. After all he's been through, it's shocking that Jake Roberts isn't dead, but he's thriving because 60 years of misery was apparently his limit. By 2012, Roberts was a total mess. He weighed well over 300 pounds and could barely walk. At that point, his savior arrived. Diamond Dallas Page, an ex-wrestler whom Roberts had trained years earlier. Not wanting to see his trainer and friend waste away any longer, Page pitched his DDP yoga program, hoping to get Roberts back in shape and discipline him enough to stay sober. Jake, perhaps finally sick of his old life, gave the program a shot. Between the DDP yoga program and actually eating real food for once, he dropped 40 pounds in just a few months and dedicated himself entirely to his new lifestyle. As he told Newsday, "We're changing the oil, we're changing the headlights, we're changing the damn tires, everything, and it's going to be a long journey, but I'm excited." It's paid off immensely as WWE fans saw for themselves in early 2014. Roberts appeared unannounced on WWE Raw and looked to be in phenomenal shape. He had dropped enough weight that he looked largely like he did in the 80s, minus the mullets, and appeared lucid as could be. As further proof that Roberts is finally healthy both physically and mentally, he dealt with a pair of setbacks in 2014 that could have either killed him or made him fall off the wagon, but he beat them both and is still around and in prime form today. Early that year, Roberts told TMZ he had a cancerous tumor behind his knee that would require surgery, but he seemed as optimistic as ever. "If the devil can't defeat me, cancer doesn't stand a chance in hell." After surgery and recovery, he was just fine. Later that year, he came down with double pneumonia. It was severe enough that he lost consciousness in the hospital several times, but he wasn't interested in dying or giving up. According to Dallas Page, he cared more about missing appearances or letting down fans. The snake's still here, so clearly he beat it. All signs point to the tragic part of Jake's life story being over and it being a happier one from here on out. Hopefully that story will involve at least a few more DDTs and snakes slithering around the ring before it's done.
The life of a wrestler is much harder than it looks. Suffering from physical and emotional turmoil, many wrestlers don't make it to the young age of 40. Sarah Lee's journey to wrestling began with competitive powerlifting, as recounted by CNN. She went on to be featured on the WWE reality show competition Tough Enough in 2015, where she became the surprise winner. Lee was the fan favorite, and she won $250,000 in a one-year WWE contract, where she made an appearance in the company's offshoot NXT program and made her first match as part of a tag team. Lee married wrestler Weston Blake, and they had 3 kids together. After giving birth to a daughter in 2017, she continued training, according to Wrestling News. But Sarah Lee was only 30 years old when her mother announced on Facebook that she had died. Her cause of death was never revealed. Many of her fellow wrestlers paid tribute to Lee on social media, including Chelsea Green, who posted happy photos of them together on Twitter. Wrestler Bull James then organized a GoFundMe campaign to help Blake and their children. Ashley Massaro was only 39 years old when she died in 2019. After being discovered in the WWE's Raw Diva search, she earned a $250,000 one-year contract, but she went on to make a name for herself in the company from 2005 to 2008. The highlight of her career was the championship match against Melina at WrestleMania 23, but her career wasn't able to go much further than that. Reports indicated that Massaro died by suicide, following many problems during Massaro's tenure. In 2006, Massaro took part in a WWE trip to Kuwait, during which Massaro said she was raped by a military doctor. According to an affidavit that was made public after her death, Massaro said that former WWE CEO Vince McMahon warned her not to disclose the assault for fear it would disrupt their partnership with the U.S. military. Former wrestler Paul London said on Rene Dupree's podcast that Massaro had been repeatedly harassed by McMahon, who would bring her to tears. After leaving the WWE in 2008, Massaro also had issues from the long-term effects of concussions and took part in a class action lawsuit against the WWE for not properly protecting her and other wrestlers from brain damage. Massaro said she suffered from depression and memory loss as a result. Andrew Test Martin came onto the scene as Motley Crue's bodyguard and a man willing to throw fans off the stage. He aligned himself with the corporation, cozied up to Vince McMahon's daughter, and then proceeded to win 5 championships with WCW and WWE. However, his career didn't pan out the way it could have, despite the elaborate storylines he was given early on in his career. After a second stint with WWE, he was suspended due to violations of the company's wellness policy after testing positive for testosterone per ESPN. Test kept wrestling for other promotions before his death in 2009 at 33 years old. His cause of death was attributed to an accidental overdose of oxycodone. However, he caught the attention of noted concussion doctor Bennett Omalu, who analyzed Martin's brain posthumously and found that Test's brain resembled that of an elderly Alzheimer's patient. Before his death, Test mentioned he had 8 funerals for wrestling colleagues and didn't want to have that same fate. Kerry Von Erich was part of a legendary family of wrestlers. Following in their father Fritz Von Erich's footsteps, Kevin, David, Kerry, Mike, and Chris became superstar wrestlers and competed in Fritz's promotion, World Class Championship Wrestling. Kerry was the most famous and went on to compete for the WWE and won the Intercontinental Championship in 1990. Kerry's career would be short-lived. Kerry suffered from substance abuse problems after a motorcycle accident led to his right foot being amputated, the Baltimore Sun reports. In 1992, he was sentenced to 10 years of probation for cocaine possession. but prosecutors were eager to send him to prison. Not a week after a warrant for his arrest was issued, Kerry's body was found at his father's ranch. He had died by suicide at 33 years old. His father said tax problems, along with the death of his brothers, had weighed heavily on Kerry and led to his depression. 4 of the Von Erich brothers had already died, 2 of which were labeled as suicides, with another remaining in question. The string of tragedies have led people to believe the family was cursed, but their legacy will live on as one of the first successful wrestling families. A 3rd generation of Von Erichs continue on in the ring. Umaga, with his tattooed face and 348-pound frame, is kind of hard to forget. He came on the WWE scene in 2002, made the main roster in 2006, and was released only 3 years later. During that stint, he managed to make a name for himself and participate in a few memorable fights. The Samoan Bulldozer put up a string of victories that could have only been ended by John Cena. His first match was against former world champion Ric Flair, and he quickly racked up wins against other marquee names, but he never won a WWE championship. He did, however, win the Intercontinental Championship 2 times. Umaga, whose real name was Eddie Fatu, was a member of the famous Anoa'i wrestling family, along with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and Roman Reigns. But only 6 months after his stint with WWE ended, Umaga died at 36 years old. He had suffered a heart attack, which was caused by a deadly combination of painkillers and a muscle relaxant, the Associated Press reported. His death initiated another discussion on the taxing demands of wrestling. Along with Umaga, Yokozuna was another modern-day wrestler hailing from the Anoa'i family. Debuting in 1992, Yokozuna set out upon a path of destruction at WWE and topped several superstars with his 6-foot 4-inch and 600-pound frame. He held the championship title 2 times, and the first win was one for the record books. After defeating legend Bret Hart for the title, it was taken from him only 2 minutes later by Hulk Hogan. That said, Yokozuna, whose real name was Rodney Anoa'i, once didn't receive clearance for wrestling due to weighing 660 pounds, as reported by Sportscasting. Ultimately, he remained with WWE for only 5 years and later explored his options elsewhere, but his independent career didn't last for long. Like Umaga, Yokozuna's career was cut short. He died in 2000 at the age of 34 due to a pulmonary edema. The death of WWE star Shad Gaspard is particularly heart-wrenching. On May 17, 2020, Gaspard and his 10-year-old son went swimming at Venice Beach in Los Angeles, but were caught in a deadly riptide, reports BBC News. Lifeguards came onto the scene, but evidently could only save one, and in an act of sacrifice, Gaspard told them to save his son first. Gaspard did not survive. He was only 39 years old. Prior to becoming a wrestler, Gaspard was a celebrity bodyguard for Mike Tyson and Britney Spears. Once at WWE, he was known as The Beast and became part of the fighting duo Crime Time with wrestler JTG. In 2009, they competed for tag team titles at SummerSlam. After leaving the promotion, Gaspard returned to his Hollywood roots and started an acting career appearing in the 2015 film Get Hard. Upon his death, he received tributes from The Rock, Dave Bautista, and Triple H, among others. Crash Holly is often an overlooked member of the WWE's Attitude Era, but he was once a World Tag Team Champion as one half of the Holly Cousins. With his debut in 2000, Crash had a lot of spunk and used his small frame to his advantage, providing comic relief through an ongoing bid after he won the WWE Hardcore Championship. Crash said that he could defend the title 24/7 no matter the location, starting a new tradition. The challenge found him trying to fight off other wrestlers at airport baggage claims, hotel rooms, and even at a circus. He eventually lost it after being hit with a trash can. Crash, whose real name was Michael John Lockwood, later won the European Championship and the Light Heavyweight Championship, but his career with WWE came to an end when he was released in 2003. In November of that year, it was reported that Crash died by suicide after taking alcohol and muscle relaxants. He was only 32 years old. Adrian Adonis had a short but memorable career as one of WWE's top villains. He came onto the wrestling scene with the American Wrestling Association in 1979, where he won a title, and he soon joined the WWE roster. In 1985, he made his heel persona more flamboyant, wearing pink clothing and overdone makeup, taking on the personality of adorable Adrian Adonis, who used his effeminate style to antagonize others. which was quite the turn from his previous leather jacket era. After a peak in which he fought Hulk Hogan for his championship title, Adonis was fired in 1987. Adonis died a year later after a tragic car accident. He and 3 other wrestlers were riding along the Trans-Canada Highway when they suddenly swerved off the road, likely to avoid a moose per UPI. The car landed into a brook, and the 3 passengers sustained life-ending injuries. Adonis was only 34 years old. Lance Cade came onto the scene as Shawn Michaels' protege, having been trained and given a contract by him in 1999. In 2003, Cade made his WWE debut, forming 2 different tag teams with Mark Jindrak and Trevor Murdoch, the latter earning him multiple tag team championships, notes the Bleacher Report. One of his biggest fights came against Michaels in 2008. He lost, marking his final major match with the WWE, ending a career that never fully blossomed. Cade was released from his contract for reasons not fully clear, but it seemed like a comeback was on the horizon when he was rehired in 2009. However, an addiction to sleeping pills stunted that possibility, and Cade was again left without a WWE job. In August 2010, Cade died at the age of 29. He had been suffering from an enlarged heart, possibly due to steroid or drug use. The medical examiner's report revealed that he had consumed a fatal mixture of drugs, which exacerbated his condition.
A last voicemail before a sudden death. What did wrestler Roddy Piper say to a friend shortly before he died of a heart attack? His and other wrestlers' final words are more tragic and surprising than you might believe. A member of the legendary Hart wrestling family, Owen Hart played a pivotal part in world wrestling entertainment throughout the 90s. At the 1999 Over the Edge pay-per-view held in Kansas City, Missouri, Owen Hart died a tragic, in-ring death as a pre-planned flashy entrance went horribly wrong. Wrestling as the Blue Blazer, the performer was meant to descend from the rafters before his match against The Godfather for the Intercontinental Championship. However, the release mechanism connecting his harness to the rope gave way as the wrestler plummeted from the top of the arena and crashed onto the ring ropes. Hart was pronounced dead a few minutes later. Appearing on the Dark Side of the Ring episode, The Final Days of Owen Hart, wrestling manager and on-screen personality Jim Cornette stated, "When Owen was falling, everybody that was there said the last thing that he yelled was, 'Look out.'" In late 2000s WWE, Shad Gaspard made a name for himself as part of the tag team Crime Time, along with his partner, JTG. The pair played goofy criminals who would do everything from scalping tickets outside of the arena to stealing other wrestlers' personal items. In May 2020, the 39-year-old Gaspard encountered rough ocean conditions in Venice Beach and subsequently drowned. According to the New York Times, the professional wrestler and his 10-year-old son, Arya, were swimming in the ocean when the currents turned turbulent. An on-duty male lifeguard noticed the incident and rushed into the sea to pull them out. Since Arya was closer, the lifeguard managed to get him first. However, when he went back for Gaspard, the wrestler disappeared under a massive wave. Gaspard's body was found on the beach 3 days later. According to witnesses, Gaspard's only concern was for the safety of his son, as he urged the lifeguard to help Arya.
He handed off his son and pushed him and said, "Save my son."
Widely regarded as one of the greatest in-ring performers of all time and a generational talent, Eddie Guerrero reached the top of the WWE mountain in 2004, winning his sole WWE championship after defeating Brock Lesnar at the No Way Out pay-per-view. Even after losing the title a while later, he continued to be a beloved performer among fans as he would lie, cheat, and steal his way to victory. In November 2005, the wrestling world received a major shock after the 38-year-old Guerrero died of a heart attack. Later, it was confirmed that Guerrero had a heart disease exacerbated by years of using steroids, as well as the recent usage of pain medication. According to the Wrestling Observer newsletter, Guerrero's final words were spoken to his wife, Vicky. Reportedly, the couple chatted at 2:30 in the morning, just before he went to bed, when he took the opportunity to express his love for her. Antonio Inoki remains one of the most important and prominent names in Japanese and global pro wrestling as a whole. As an all-star performer and promoter, his love for sports entertainment shone through in everything he did, which even saw him take on legend Muhammad Ali in a wrestling versus boxing contest. In 2022, Inoki died at the age of 79, with NJPW revealing the cause to be amyloidosis, a disease that affects the organs. Before his death, a 10-minute video was released of him in the hospital where he addressed his fans. In the footage, Inoki admitted that he didn't want people to see him in that condition, but he wanted to address those wondering about him. Toward the end of the video, the cameraman told him that everyone was rooting for him. In cheerful fashion, Inoki said, "This voice that I have is my number one rival, but as long as one has an adversary to push you on, isn't that a good thing?" Macho Man Randy Savage ran wild in the 80s. Even though the focus may have been on Hulk Hogan as the face of pro wrestling in that era, every fan, pundit, and performer recognized the extraordinary abilities of Savage both on the microphone and in between the ropes. After jumping ship from WWE to WCW in the 90s, Savage continued to capture the attention of the world with his over-the-top wrestling persona and buckets of charisma. One of his most high-profile appearances came in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, where he plays Bonesaw McGraw, essentially a prototype version of the Macho Man character.
Hey, Freak Joe! You're going nowhere!
By 2011, Savage was no longer an active wrestler, living a quiet life out of the spotlight. This all changed on May 20th, when Savage died of heart disease. This caused him to lose consciousness while driving the car that carried him and his wife, Lynn. Savage's wife only suffered minor injuries in the resultant accident after her husband passed out at the wheel. According to Bleacher Report, Savage told his wife he was feeling unwell that morning. Lynn thought nothing of it, thinking he only needed to eat breakfast. However, she noticed he still didn't look himself after they had stopped at a restaurant for a meal, and she offered to drive. Savage declined. According to Lynn, he told her, "I think I'm going to pass out," a statement which proved to be his last words. He was 58 years old. John Huber became a household name as Luke Harper, a sinister member of the cult-like Wyatt family, on WWE television. In December 2019, however, Huber departed WWE. He would reappear in All Elite Wrestling a few months later under the moniker of Brody Lee, a name that Huber had used in his early wrestling days. Lee made an instant splash, being revealed as the leader of the burgeoning faction known as the Dark Order and winning the TNT Championship from Cody Rhodes. Despite making a fast start to life in AEW, Lee disappeared from the screens a few months later. In December 2020, it was announced that Lee had died. His wife, Amanda, revealed on the AEW Unrestricted podcast that he had died from idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. At the same time, Amanda also shared heartwarming stories about Lee and their kids. She revealed how their son Brody wanted to dress up as AEW wrestler Orange Cassidy for Halloween. However, Amanda pointed out that Cassidy only wears sunglasses and a denim jacket, so that isn't really a costume. When she visited her husband in the hospital, she told him how Brody was upset with her for not buying him the denim jacket. She said on the podcast, "I'm not even joking when I say that one of the last spoken words my husband said to me was, 'Go buy him a denim jacket.'" The Ultimate Warrior flexed his way into WWE folklore. However, he had numerous issues with the company before being inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2014. In fact, it seemed all but impossible that they would work together again. But the relevant parties managed to put aside their differences and come together to honor the legacy of the man billed as hailing from parts unknown. After appearing at the Hall of Fame ceremony, Warrior stopped by Monday Night Raw on April 7th. Going out in front of the live crowd, he cut one of his typical nonsensical promos that only he could understand. Nothing too out of the ordinary for anyone who watched him in the 80s and 90s, really. He closed off his speech by saying, "I am Ultimate Warrior. You are the Ultimate Warrior fans, and the spirit of Ultimate Warrior will run forever." This would prove to be one of his final statements, as Warrior died a day later. Warrior was walking with his wife to the car when he passed out and was taken to a hospital, but it was too late. The Ultimate Warrior's autopsy report revealed he died from cardiovascular disease. He was 54 years old. Joni Laurer, or Chyna, broke the mold for female performers in WWE as she defied the traditional model of how women were seen and presented on wrestling television. Billed as the ninth wonder of the world, Chyna became the first woman to hold the Intercontinental Championship and formed a critical part of the legendary faction D-Generation X, becoming one of the biggest stars of the company's Attitude Era. In April 2016, however, news broke that Chyna had died. According to the autopsy report, her cause of death was related to a combination of alcohol, muscle relaxants, and painkillers. She was only 46 years old. A year later, documentary filmmaker Eric Angra shared the last voicemail he received from China with People. Angra had been filming a documentary about her life, and the pair had been in regular communication. In the message, which is believed to be one of her final communications with anyone, China tells Angra that she planned on going to rehab, while also asking the filmmaker how he was doing. She ends the nearly 4-minute message by saying, "Love you, bye." Matt Osborne struggled to make a name for himself in the professional wrestling business until he put on clown makeup. As the villainous Doink the Clown, Osborne tickled the audience's fancy with a gimmick that hadn't been seen on television before. Although he never won a major championship, he remained a mainstay of WWE programming in the early 90s. In June 2013, the 55-year-old Osborne died of an accidental drug overdose. While Osborne had a history of addiction, his daughter Tegan and ex-wife Michelle James suggested something far more nefarious could have been at play involving his girlfriend, Connie Cook, in the Dark Side of the Ring episode, What Happened to Doink the Clown. According to them, James had spoken to Osborne the night before he died. He informed her that he was leaving his girlfriend and that if something were to happen to him, she must take it further. James said in the episode, "I said, Matt, what are you talking about? Why would you say that?" He went, "Seriously, don't let it go." Cook denied any wrongdoing in Osborne's death. Film buffs know Rowdy Roddy Piper for his turn as John Nada in John Carpenter's They Live.
I have come here to chew bubblegum and kick ass.
However, true culture connoisseurs appreciate him for being one of the greatest on-screen bad guys in professional wrestling history. Look no further than his epic feud with Mr. T in the mid-'80s to see exactly what he was all about. Hot Rod loved to torment his opponents and bend the rules to his advantage, becoming a dastardly figure in both WWE and WCW. Even when Piper played a heroic role, everyone knew a swerve was around the corner. In July 2015, Piper died in his sleep at the age of 61. According to the Washington Post, his official cause of death was listed as a heart attack due to a blood clot. Speaking on his Something to Wrestle podcast, Piper's friend and wrestling executive Bruce Pritchard revealed he received a voicemail from Hot Rod the evening before he died. Pritchard explained how Piper wasn't the kind of person who would complain about his health. However, that day he told him he was feeling unwell. Pritchard said on the podcast, he said, "Because I'm not feeling well, I'm tired. I'm going to go to bed. I just wanted to call and tell you I love you."
That was one of the last calls he made.
Frank Goodish, better known by his stage name Bruiser Brody, lived up to his wrestling moniker, utilizing a bruising style in the ring to punish his opponents. He's also one of the wrestlers who died under suspicious circumstances. In 1988, Brody died after he was stabbed several times in the shower by fellow performer Jose Gonzalez in Puerto Rico. Reportedly, Gonzalez had asked Brody to meet him by the showers to talk, then pulled out a concealed knife to stab Brody. Gonzalez claimed he acted in self-defense and was acquitted of the charges. Throughout the years, Tony Atlas has recalled his version of events on that fateful day, and he did it once again on the Monty and the Pharaoh podcast. Atlas was with Brody and revealed what were some of the performer's final words before he succumbed to his wounds.
Callers come over and ask Brody, say, anything I could do for you? Brody said, take care of my family.